Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that might change its name to Kim, just to get Trump's attention. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well. I'm ecstatic. We'll come to it in the headlines, but there are reasons that I am very, very happy today.
I think I can guess. Even I was tweeted about the thing you're alluding to there. Champagne super over from The Telegraph. So you've noted in the show notes you're going to just talk about cricket here. I'll just put in a quick plug right now because I was told by one of our listeners that I totally should have mentioned that you were guesting on Hat Many Things and give a link to the episode where we discussed various types of sports ball. And the second part of the episode should be going up this week as well. So I will drop a link in the show notes to that as well.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Yes. This is the news that unless you are under a rock or really don't like cricket, that England have won the Cricket World Cup. And we didn't just do it like most cricket games with it being a bit boring. We did it in the most awkward English way possible. Did you get to see any of it, Wilco? Or
I've seen a few clips, but I was on my way back from camp, so I kind of came into the conversation just as it got exciting, but the TV was on something else. My housemates were playing video games, so I didn't actually see the action, I'm afraid. I just saw the clip of the... I've forgotten his name already. Was it Coates?
Ben Stokes?
Stokes! I was so close.
Yeah, I can see you're gripped by cricket fever as well, so I'll make this short and sweet before you pass out. It was a game which, well, I watched it with a friend who wasn't familiar with cricket, so he was watching it from about 11:15 and watched the whole thing with me. So he watched the first half and it was, this is a bit, England seem to have done all right here, this is fair enough. And then England start and it's a bit dodgy, and then it gets to like a really boring 20 over bit in the middle where we're like, oh goodness, England are throwing this away. And then the tension just slowly ratcheted up and up and up. And those last 10 overs, I was on the edge of my seat. Are we going to do it? Are we not? Ben Stokes hit a 6 that was, hit a ball that was caught by somebody in the deep, and then he stepped on the rope, which meant instead of it being out, it was a 6. So, hooray, 6 more runs is just like, that's such a huge swing in this game, brought it back in England's favour. Then we needed 15 runs off the last over. The first 2 balls, he scored nothing off them. The third ball, he scored a 6. And then the fourth ball, they ran 2. They threw the ball back in, and as our bloke was diving to make his ground, the ball deflected off his bat and went for 4 extra runs. So instead of 2, that was a 6 as well. Just mad stuff that never happens. And earlier in the game, my friend had turned to me and said, what happens if it's a draw? And I said, they do a super over, but that never happens. Like, don't worry about it. So, of course, it was fate that we'd have a super over. I saw the statistician and comedian Andy Zaltzman tweet earlier that it was only that there have been like over 4,000 games of cricket, and there have only ever been over 4,000 games of one-day international cricket, and out of those there have only been about 21 games that have gone to a super over or ended in a draw. There have been about 462 World Cup games, and of those only 4 have gone for a draw. So statistically, you're due a super over in a World Cup final once every 400 years.
Wow. Cricket hasn't been around that long.
Exactly, yeah. So the odds of this were remarkable. England scored 15 runs off their super over, and New Zealand had to score 16 by virtue of England having scored more boundaries, which is something that nobody's really tracking or aiming for, and is sort of like really down the list of rules. If you want to see how to win a cricket game, it's like the last thing you should be thinking about. But anyway, New Zealand had to score 16. In the end, they scored 15, which technically means that England and New Zealand drew twice, but they had to give it to England. And yeah, cue scenes of me jumping around a friend's house, scaring the living bejesus out of their cat, and being a very happy Rob. So I couldn't let this go past without mentioning a little thing about the cricket, so just indulge me this once.
No, I mean, I'm sure our listeners will indulge you. It's a pretty, our national spirit right now is probably at, maybe not an all-time low, but we're not having the best of years with all the Brexit stuff going on, regardless of where you fall on the Brexit spectrum. So, having something that everyone can kind of get behind and go, oh, that was pretty good. And we did very well in the Women's World Cup as well. We didn't win, but we were doing quite well in that. So I think there's a bit of sport to take people's mind off things, which is kind of, I suppose, the point of sport for a lot of people. So that's always good. And so now on to our main story for tonight. Brexit things to look out for. So we're about to slide into silly season, which means technically government's not going to be meeting over summer. We'll probably touch on that a bit, I think, in the upcoming story. But yes, that means Brexit can be on our minds over the summer, but we're going to take a break and do some other topics, as we mentioned before. But I think this is a summary of where we are and what we need to be thinking about before September hits. And we've only got, is it 2 months from the start of September? Because it's the end of October. We currently have an extension till.
Yes, yeah. That's exactly it. Just sort of looking forward, even if we're not mentioning Brexit in our podcast directly, it will be happening in the background. So it's just sort of 4 points to, keep an eye out for, keep noticed, things that I think have, things that have popped up in the last week that could build into bigger stories. Clearly, if there's any sort of absolute bombshells, we may do a special episode over the summer, but fingers crossed, we just keep sort of trickling along with this. Do you want to dive into sort of the first things to look out for?
Yeah, so we alluded to it in the news just then, but Boris versus Hunt is still the big thing. We know which one of them will be our next Prime Minister, and I mean, it's hard to tell if the gap is closing because, as we said before, it goes to the Conservative Party membership and not to the general public. But at least this definitely feels more like we're more involved than we were in the election of Theresa May to be head of the party. Like they've had these debates, and as we mentioned earlier, talking about Trump and the ambassador and stuff was live in the debate, right?
Whoever is the next Prime Minister will clearly have quite a big impact on Brexit, and it has been one of the big talking points in all of their debates. What I'm going to go with here is that Boris is clearly the favourite, and Boris is clearly more no deal than Hunt. Hunt has been on record saying that he can't promise that we'd be out by Christmas, while Boris has sort of clearly said that no, Boris has backed himself to do a deal with the EU and thinks that that's possible, but thinks it's absolutely vital that if we can't, we should get out on October 31st. And I just wanted to touch on one of the cornerstones of Boris's argument, and one that's sort of heavily debated and queried between Brexiteers and Remainers. People have got a very different view on it, depending on how you view Brexit. So have you heard of Article 24 and GATT? Have you heard this?
Well, no, I mean, I was going to say, having looked through this list, there's a few acronyms we might need to explain to our listeners. So I heard mention of Article 24, but I'm not sure what GATT is, so fill me in.
GATT is an acronym for General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and is a multi-unilateral international treaty signed in 1947 to promote trade. And essentially it's governed by the World Trade Organization. So this is Boris talking about a clause under WTO rules. Now, WTO is the World Trade Organization. This is the stuff that we've sort of said that we would have to fall under if no deal happens. And lots of Remainers in particular are quite worried that these rules are not set up to be, they're no replacement for the EU and the deals that we've already got. Boris argues that under Article 24, it says that you can keep your you can allow the UK to sort of trade with the EU without tariffs. So that's taxes on goods crossing its borders for up to 10 years, which sounds great. Basically means that we can have a no-deal scenario for 10 years and the EU couldn't punish us or by putting we couldn't put tariffs on EU goods. That would keep EU goods cheaply coming into the UK. That would encourage trade. The EU should be fine with this because it's pretty much the agreement that we've got now. Everybody wins. What are you worried about, you Remoaners? Essentially, that's what Boris's argument is. Like, no deal is not as big a risk as you think of because we can trigger Article 24. There's a couple of caveats to this, and this is what makes Remainers nervous. So first of all, the WTO says that we'd have to apply that 0% tariff not only to EU goods, but to all other countries as well.
So that's like just opening all the borders. We can import and export everything, no tariffs, but suddenly stuff that we will have had tariffs on will have no tariffs, so it will just flood the market with cheaper goods, right?
Exactly. And what happens when you flood the market with cheaper goods, do you think?
Well, prices have to go down to be competitive, and businesses that don't do that will go out of business and might go out of business anyway. And presumably it's going to affect local businesses that charge higher prices because they employ British people as opposed to being abroad where, as we know, like China, for example, it's much cheaper to produce things.
Yeah, exactly. So this is sort of the opposite is what's happening with the tariff war between the US and China. The US is putting tariffs up on Chinese goods, and the Chinese are putting tariffs up on US goods to try and encourage people to buy locally. Now, that has the knock-on effect of making Chinese imports quite expensive in America, and that might have a knock-on that some businesses go out of, can't continue their work because, they rely on imports of cheap Chinese steel or something like that. But that's meant to encourage growth in US steel. This whole sort of process of maybe weakening British business by opening your borders to everyone might be against what I think is the Brexiteer economic mindset in one way. So I think if the WTO insisted that we apply that to all other countries, that would be bad. So that's one thing against the Brexiteer argument there. The second thing is that Article 24 is dependent on if the UK has a plan and a schedule for a trade agreement in the future. So,
may I react to that in the only way I think is possible at this stage? Oh, no.
Exactly. The idea that we have a plan is indeed laughable. And Brexiteers the Brexiteer argument is that, of course, we've got a plan. Of course, the EU would want a deal with us. Like, the UK is the 5th largest economy in the world. We're one of the biggest trading partners with the EU. Why would they just shun us and say that, no, they don't want to deal with us at all? This means that we can enact Article 24 with no problem. Remainers think the opposite. They think that no deal means exactly that. There's no deal. There's no agreement. If there's no agreement and there's no talking between the two sides, then there is no plan and schedule. So GATT 24 wouldn't apply. This has had a little bit of traction with the debates, and I think in particular there was a clip between Boris and when he was being interviewed by Andrew Neil on the politics show for the BBC, where Andrew Neil says, "Have you read Article 24, Section B?" And Boris Johnson goes into great detail, and then he says, "Oh, but have you read Section C?" And Boris is like, "I don't know what's in that section. Have you read it, though? I don't know what's in that section. Have you read it?" "Oh, no, I haven't. And Andrew Neil, though, then goes on to say that Section C essentially undermines Boris's argument entirely. So I think if Boris was to become PM, it's likely that this idea will come under even more scrutiny. And particularly, the sort of what it brings me on to my next point is that it will become under a lot of scrutiny from the EU, who so far have been silent on this issue, but if Boris becomes PM, it becomes like a very real thing that the EU has to react to.
So, leading into that, what do we think? Can we guess anything about the EU's reaction at this point? Do we have a feeling for how they're going to react to either Boris or Hunt at this point?
Well, I think one thing's clear is that they're quite upset that they've lost Theresa May. Theresa May was the person who they did the deal with. That was the deal that wasn't changing. They would have preferred May to stay in and force a deal through Parliament. The fact she had to resign means that the EU now has to deal with another Prime Minister who might try to renegotiate that deal. Now, I think Hunt has already said that he would try to negotiate a little bit, and if the EU didn't give them anything by the end of September, then he'd go into full no-deal planning. Boris has been sort of more bullish about his approach to how he would deal with the EU, sort of very adamant that, he keeps banging on about no deal, but he keeps saying at the same time that, no deal isn't his preferred option. He'd prefer to do a deal with the EU and it should change. How they approach the EU and how they deal with that statesmanship, with the sort of with the politics of the EU is different. We talked about May's maybe one of May's big failings was that it was very clear in the media that she spoke to the EU with one face in quite a conciliatory tone and yes, we must do this, and then she'd go back to the UK and slag them off or do something that the EU hadn't agreed with in meetings, and then sort of had to go back to Theresa May and put her in line and say, no, we didn't say that. You've got to correct yourself. I think May might have been easier to control from the EU's point of view by telling her off. Boris will be far more outspoken, as he will be, and there's an idea that if you don't treat him with that respect, the relationship between the EU and Britain could go sour quite fast, even more than it did under May. So I think that's another factor that makes a no deal more likely between Britain and the EU. Then again, if Boris becomes leader, it's more likely that he won't cough up the 39 billion. That's another point that he's been saying. So he might try to argue that we've saved 39 billion by not doing this, but by not doing a deal that costs us 39 billion, we can invest this in no deal Brexit Britain. However, how would he invest that money, and if it would actually end up as a net gain or a net loss is still up for debate. And that whole sort of question about how the economy will do is another part of the equation that I'd like to add to as well.
So we've gone through this kind of strange period where we've gone past the deadline, and I think we touched on it back then that there was a kind of slowing down of investment in business, things like that. We've now had a few months of being past that Brexit deadline and everyone being confused about exactly what's happening. So where does that put us in economic terms?
Yeah, so as I always say when I start conversations on the economy, I'm not an economist, but I believe that I can have a look at the main news, look at the periods of growth, and sort of ascertain from that why, look at what the economists are saying about why the UK is either shrinking or growing. So one of the big things that happened at the start of the year, in the first quarter, the economy grew by 0.5%, which on the face of it sounds quite good. And I believe there are a lot of people at the time sort of tweeting that, this is signs of growth in the economy despite Brexit. It was actually because of Brexit that the economy grew so much in that period. So that was mostly people stockpiling or ramping up manufacturing, preparing for a no deal. That includes supplies of like medicines and raw materials, stuff that they wanted to make sure we were prepared for if suddenly we were unable to import goods from the EU. After this, there was a sharp decline in things such as like car production because factories stopped because they'd produced quickly in bulk to prepare for the no deal. And when that didn't happen, they'd produced too many cars already. So they actually had to shut down for a little while. And this put the economy again into a little bit of a slowdown and a shrink. Now the latest figures have been released for June, I believe. Okay, sorry, the figures were released for May that showed a small return to growth of 0.3%, but essentially growth has all but flatlined for the UK. And what this means is that we're essentially in that waiting period again. We hit one no deal deadline, and that passed, so we had that quick spike, and then the economy went down again. Now we're levelling out, just waiting for things to happen. Depending on how negotiations go between Boris and the EU, or Hunt and the EU, if that becomes a possibility, the more the prospects of no deal become, I reckon that we'll again see a spike in production. It probably won't be as big as the initial spike, because I think it's likely that a lot of car manufacturers will have, still have some left over from the last time they stockpiled, and it's probably true of many other retailers as well. But it's this uncertainty, and particularly that political uncertainty, that breeds the fears of like less growth in Britain and, slowing it to a crawl. Keeping an eye on those figures and seeing how many times Britain can survive these no deal scares is worth it. I think the more no deal scares we have, like there's a law of diminishing returns, we'll eventually like stop stockpiling, or our stockpiles will be ready to go so much that you won't see a little economic boost by the threat of a no deal. Once no deal happens, then I'm afraid your guess is as good as mine about how the economy goes. Brexiteers will tell you that it's a utopia and full of potential, whereas, Remainers and The Bank of England will tell you that there's a great deal of economic risk going with that's attached to a no deal. Obviously, that won't be decided by the time that we come back from silly season, but those little signs will be there in the Office for National Statistics report. So my advice would just be over the coming months, keep an eye out for those. They're released every month. The BBC does tend to report quite well on them. And if you see those spikes or see things, just take every figure with a pinch of salt. I know that another thing that sort of drove the Brexit debate was this distrust of experts, or economists predicted it would crash after the Brexit vote, and we haven't experienced a massive recession since then. And people are right, but what economists do is they imagine you're rolling two sets of dice. You can get anywhere between a 2 or a 12 score on those. Economists tell you, and the Bank of England will tell you what happens when you roll a 7, because there's lots of combinations for getting a 7, and that's the most likely scenario. Now, we might be really lucky and roll a 12 and far surpass those expectations, and that's great, but just remember that the chances of that are really small, and actually it could be equally a lot worse than we think, and we could roll a 2 instead. So just remember, it's all predictions, it's all work, it's never certain. Things happen within the economy. If the weather's good over the summer, that can provide a boost. Whatever Trump does, something that's entirely out of our control, if suddenly he lowers tariffs or ups tariffs, that might have an effect on our economy as well. So there's lots of variables in play, but most of the time the Bank of England is within a sufficient margin of error. Just remember that they're predicting the 7 score, not the other ones.
And I'd also say that there's a type of statistics called Bayesian analysis, where you're talking, what you're doing, you start off with an assumption at the start, right? This is where we are now. This is all the information we can possibly put together, and we make predictions based on data. You're constantly updating what your thoughts are. This isn't as static as the dice. I know the dice analogy is very nice, but this isn't as static as that. It's a thing that's constantly changing. So, and I think this is often a problem. Maybe it's something we should do in another episode. There's all this stuff about we don't trust experts. Experts are wrong. But the thing is that experts, when they're wrong, will adjust their models and try and fix things. Like we've seen this with 538, where they've had some massive swings, and people are we didn't predict the US election cycle correctly. But it was obviously within the realm of possibility he considered. It just wasn't necessarily the most likely candidate. But as you say, sometimes you roll a 12, and real life cannot be perfectly predicted, otherwise we'd always have a perfect weather forecast. So I don't think we can be too I don't think the fact that we didn't immediately have a recession after Brexit is a reason to be all economists are telling us fibs, because A, they were making certain assumptions, and B, they didn't say we're going to immediately have a recession day after the vote. That wasn't what they said. That's kind of how it gets dumbed down by the newspapers. So I think there's just a lot more nuance in these things, as always in any discussion, and it can't just be shrunk down to this very simple kind of binary, there will be I suppose you can say whether there is a recession or not is a binary thing, but I think people are there will immediately be one. That's not how it works. They're saying there will eventually be a recession, and I probably would stick with that being likely if we're going the way we're going. So next, there's been some interesting kind of developments. I suppose this is a part of the story for those of you who are really into parliamentary procedure. And I think possibly the most interesting bit for me is that the Queen seems to always get dragged into these kind of discussions. Couldn't the Queen do this? Couldn't the Queen do this? Because she technically has all these powers that she doesn't use, because then the monarchy would be gotten rid of, probably. So, why do people want to close Parliament?
So, if you're a Brexiteer, they have a very, very cunning plan, which is quite simply Parliament keeps rejecting the deal, Theresa May's deal, and also it keeps rejecting no deal. And as Parliament is sovereign, most of the time you have to listen to Parliament and what it says. So how do you stop Parliament meeting, voting on stopping a no deal on the 31st of October? Quite simply, you shut it down and make sure it can't do business for the day. This is called proroguing, and I was informed by a lovely BBC article that the last time it was done was in 1948, to try and stop the Lords from blocking a certain bill. Now, it doesn't seem like the smartest of ideas, and it's certainly quite controversial for a number of reasons. Mostly because, as you inferred, Tom, that it gets the Queen involved. So the PM would then go to the Queen and say, hey, I would like you to shut Parliament down. My advice is that you shut Parliament down. And then the Queen has the power to do that. Now, as you said, could the Queen say no? She could say no, but if she does and goes against the will of Parliament, not the will of Parliament, but the will of the PM, there's a big sort of possibility this could cause a constitutional crisis. Although the Queen is sovereign, she's not a leader who has any power in her own right, and that power could be taken away from her by the Prime Minister at any moment. Nobody really wants to put the Queen in that position. This is why it is. But the fact remains that Boris Johnson has sort of floated this as a possible idea to make sure it gets through Parliament. So, with all those things in mind, could it be stopped? So, can we... The next question is, so the Queen goes ahead and says yes, can we legally challenge the Queen to stop what she's doing? Because both John Major, the former PM, and sort of like Europhile, he was a very sort of like positive member when it came to EU matters. He's sort of the Ken Clarke school. He was a prominent Remain campaigner during the referendum. He said that he would mount a legal challenge if this was taken to, if this was actually tried to be put in place by Boris Johnson. Also, Gina Miller, the lawyer who's behind the court case that went to the Supreme Court and judged that Theresa May had to have the will of Parliament to pass any Brexit deal that came to her from the EU. You could actually point to Gina Miller and say she's the person who's responsible for the current deadlock in Parliament. Originally, Theresa May would have quite liked to have just agreed it between the executive and not even had a bill passed. But due to Gina Miller, now they have to force it through Parliament. So this is exactly the sort of thing Boris Johnson is trying to get round. Back to my original point, can you challenge the Queen in a legal fight? No. The Queen is sovereign. I don't mean that the Queen can just kill somebody and get away with it.
Yeah.
I think that would cause a constitutional...
Philip, bring him here.
Yeah,
I've got an axe.
She can kill swans all she wants, but not people. So yeah, she is sort of like party to traditional laws and stuff like that would cause quite a constitutional crisis if she went around murdering people. But with this sort of stuff, it would be fuzzy. The Queen is sovereign. What she says goes. Who you can challenge, though, is the PM, and more likely the advice that the PM gives the Queen. So, is the PM giving the Queen this advice in good faith? Is the advice that the PM is giving the Queen, is that constitutional? Because if the Prime Minister tells the Queen to do something and it's unconstitutional, then it's still unconstitutional, but the person to blame is the PM, not the Queen. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think I get that, yep. I'm just really struggling with this mental image, of the Queen running around like, Philip, bring my rifle. I can see Boris Johnson coming this way.
The Queen. May I stress, listeners, that the Queen is not going to shoot somebody. This is merely a figment of my imagination. A situation developed to try and explain this. So both John Major and Gina Miller would challenge Boris Johnson through the Supreme Court to try basically saying that you've given the Queen bad advice, and this shouldn't go ahead. Personally, I think it's very unlikely Boris Johnson would try this. It would cause a raft of, it would seem very undemocratic in my eyes and would be a huge risk for a Prime Minister to do it. And also it would get Brexit kind of by default. We've said that people have argued that Boris Johnson, at least in his campaign, should be the one to unite the country. And I think the last thing that's going to unite the country is somebody sort of forcing a Brexit deal on them by a technicality.
One would assume in general Conservative MPs are not anti the monarchy, but also Boris doesn't seem like the kind of person who'd want to go up against the Queen in that way, just regardless of, I feel like that would just be so tarnishing for his image. Like, it seems like a quick way to lose your position as Prime Minister.
Yeah, exactly. for all those reasons that you said and more, I think that, it's very unlikely to happen. But an interesting side story, and one that if it's still floated, particularly if Boris keeps saying it, it might be his reaction to a failed attempt at an EU negotiation. So if it does come up, just remember that these are the sort of implications of any such action by the PM, and it would, in my mind, be seen as the last resort.
So, we put that all to one side and ask the question that we've been asking a fair bit this year, especially since March passed and we had no Brexit. General election?
I think this is just a quick reiteration of a point on the general election that I don't think there'll be one before October 31st. The only situation where Boris Johnson would risk one is that if the polls suddenly surge dramatically in his favour if he becomes Conservative leader. However, at the moment, with the Brexit Party so high, it's a risk, particularly if, as we look at the polls later, as I've mentioned a little bit, Labour seem to be having a slight surge as they win back Remain voting voters. If Boris Johnson becomes Conservative Party leader and the Brexit Party is still really big, then it becomes a massive gamble, and he might go down in history as one of the shortest serving PMs, or one of the PM who, Theresa May is the PM who took a risk and lost her majority, but she didn't lose her power. Boris Johnson could be the Prime Minister that immediately called a general election and lost his power instantly, and Jeremy Corbyn suddenly Prime Minister, and he would go down as one of the worst Conservative leaders if he did that. So it's a massive gamble, and if he were to lose it, it would sort of pave the way to say that there is no majority for a no-deal Brexit, so we'll probably prolong our sort of position, our deal position with the EU even more, and it's certainly something that the EU wouldn't like, because it would almost certainly mean, again, us kicking the can down the road. So, once again, very, very unlikely. The only thing that I think would make it happen would be a big spike for the Conservative Party after Boris is leader, so my advice would be watch the polls very closely.
There has to be a sweet spot, right, for calling a general election. I know that we now have the Fixed-Term Parliament Act, and therefore, it takes quite a lot of will to make a general election just happen. But there has to be a point, right, where they look at the numbers and they go, well, the Brexit Party's creeping up on us, this is our only chance to, win. Would they rather lose to the Brexit Party or to Labour? And I suppose that probably leads us into the polls. Yeah. And so now for our quick polls update.
As I've mentioned a couple of times, the polls are swinging slowly, and I would say very slowly, in Labour's direction. So if you have a look at the ones from the start of June, and I'll go from the YouGov ones to ComRes. So we've had two YouGov ones that have put Conservatives on +1 and +3, and one BMG poll that's put the Conservatives on +1. But since then, we've had an opinion poll for Labour putting them on +2. ComRes have put Labour on +3 and then +4, and a Salvation poll on the 11th of July that put Labour on a massive +6 with 29. Now, when that's averaged out and you look at the bigger graph at the top of the table there, that's putting Labour only on 24% overall, which is only a 1% lead over the Conservatives. So again, all these figures should be taken with a pinch of salt. But if you look where Labour was at the beginning of June and where the Conservatives were, where Labour was losing out to the Brexit Party in a lot of polls, the Brexit Party was surging. Labour even put behind the Lib Dems in one poll that we mentioned on the 29th of May, which seems a little while ago now. Labour have clawed that back just as, as they've gone for more of a Remain side, and as the Lib Dems, surge has gone back a little after there's less of that protest vote after the local elections and the EU. However, I think I only need to... You asked me if there's an optimum time to call a general election, and if you have a look at that graph, right at the top of the page, when Labour were on 25.9% in the polls and the Conservatives were on 46.4%, so a gap of almost 20%, that's when the Conservatives thought it was safe to call a general election. And look how much Labour surged within sort of a 6-week cycle.
Famously, that's the story that was told about that general election was, there's no way Corbyn can win, and then suddenly he almost did it. And in fact, he got ahead in the polls. It's just the first past the post system doesn't quite represent that in our MPs.
So it being so volatile, and there's so many risks, and particularly with a whole new party in the Brexit Party that could suddenly rise, it makes that general election unlikely, particularly with the Brexit issue unresolved. If a no-deal Brexit happened, then it might put, what's the point of the Brexit Party then? Brexit has happened. The Brexit Party sort of exists at the moment to force the Conservatives to take a more radical Brexit stance because they're taking so many votes away from them. So, again, Labour slowly regaining ground, and certainly the polls are tipping in their favour, but equally I wouldn't be throwing my hands up in the air and celebrating that a Labour government is right around the corner. There's so much stuff that can change, and ultimately it's not in Labour's hands to call the next general election. It will be the Conservatives who table the motion. It will be the Conservatives who decide when it is, and they're probably not going to do it at the most opportune time for Labour.
Yes, of course. And I mean, I think there's two things I want to take out of the graph there. One is, I know we've talked before about where do people's votes go when they change parties. There is a very clear increase in the Liberal Democrats that seems to very much marry up with a decrease in Labour, and the same can be said for Brexit Party and Conservatives. I'm sure there are some people going in between. I mean, if there's a Brexit-supporting Labour voter, they may want to go for the Brexit Party, if they don't consider the Brexit Party too right-wing for them, But you can see that those two things seem to be quite linked. And another interesting thing, that at the moment, if you took the Liberal Democrats and the Greens in a coalition, they would have the biggest percentage. And that's not an impossible idea for a coalition, I don't think. Although, again, as we say, first past the post, the raw percentage probably isn't enough there. But it's an interesting number to imagine.
It is. I think there is a by-election that will be happening soon. I can't remember where it is, so apologies for this, but I think already the Greens have decided to not field a candidate, so the Lib Dems can be the one pure pro-Remain candidate on the ballot. So this sort of pooling of pro-Remain and trying to be like the pro-Remain party to target the split that's going on between Labour, Conservatives and Brexit. I think, people who support Labour would come out and say Labour are a Remain party as well. Lib Dems would say that they're a Remain party when it's any other party apart from, a red Brexit is fine, a blue Brexit is not. It's the position of the Labour Party is what, that those the people who are Remain, very, very pro-Remain would say that. So, seeing that I hadn't done the maths on that, but you're absolutely right that if the Lib Dems and Greens added up their vote, they would be the largest party. And although that probably wouldn't convert into seats, as we've talked about a lot on this podcast, about how first past the post is a bit broken and would certainly be put to the test if the general election returned a set of results like we're looking at now. I can tell you that would leave a lot of people questioning the way first past the post worked. The fact that there could be, you could argue that there is a very strong pro-Remain position in the UK, or even a majority, is something that could influence the way that our dealings with the EU are held in the coming few months.
Yep. So a few little points of news. As I mentioned earlier on, there is an episode of Hat and Many Things called Why Sports Ball is So Great, in which Rob, Mike and Dave try and convince me that sport is great, and that I should watch more of it. I'll leave in the effusiveness of Rob about the cricket from earlier on so that you can have kind of a sample of that. I mean, it was a fun episode to record. It was a monster episode as well, but if that sounds fun to you, you're in luck, because there's another episode coming very shortly that I will hopefully finish editing tomorrow or Wednesday. So getting on that while it's hot. The other piece of news, I'm on a Discord server for another podcast I like about an RPG news podcast called Morris's Unofficial Tabletop RPG Talk, which is quite a mouthful. And I was just chatting on there with the guy who runs the podcast. He's been doing journalism in the RPG space for years, and he was like, "Oh, I've written a jingle." And he wrote out the words, and I was like, "Oh, that's quite funny. Do you have a tune?" Because they were saying, "Oh, it would be great if we had a singer." I was like, "Oh, no, I haven't got a tune." And then later on, we were talking about full chord songs and how it would fit with Old Lang Syne. And And so I just sang the lyrics to the tune of Auld Lang Syne. They've put a backing track to it, and now I'm the jingle for their silly Kickstarter game they play every week, where they try and guess the name of Kickstarters from the game. So go and check that out. I'm about 20 minutes into the episode, but the episode is really good. I've been listening. If you're into RPGs, I would totally recommend listening to that podcast, because they cover everything new to do with RPGs, and they get some really good guests on, because, as I say, they've been doing this kind of journalism for years. So yeah, go and have a listen there if you want to hear my dulcet tones singing a silly jingle. Yeah, I mean, other than that, I suppose we just need to wrap up. This is going to be our last episode of this season, unless something catastrophic happens over the summer. We will have 3 silly season episodes. We've had a few suggestions in, some on Twitter, some directly to me. We're looking forward to recording all of those. They will probably be coming out every fortnight again. The order of those based on how quickly we can get together show notes for them. I think I'll start up some documents for us today, and we can just start adding to those and see which one we can do in 2 weeks' time. There's also been talk of, I've mentioned Mishmash Mayhem last time, our kind of sister podcast, also run by some friends of mine that I upload onto tinkertailorsoldiersponge.com, and and there's talk of doing a crossover there. I'm not sure if that's going to be a patron bonus at the moment, or maybe we'll do one as a patron bonus and one as a normal episode that will go out on both feeds or something like that. But that should be a lot of fun. Mixing up the concept of fantasy fights with politics could be quite interesting. So, as I mentioned earlier, silly season is coming up. That means we're going to be doing several. I think last year we got 3 specials out in that time. And we'll hope to do the same again. I know we've got some ideas of our own that we might focus on for 45 minutes to an hour. If you have any topics you'd like to suggest, you can obviously come and suggest them on Discord. You can suggest them to us on Twitter at Umpile Podcast. You can even message us on Instagram at Umpile Podcast. Even that's mostly for us putting out short clips from the show. You can come and find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language, and you can find us on our website, parliamentary.observer. You can also now email us at unparliamentary@tinkertailorsoldiersponge.com. And of course, if you can go over to patreon.com/TTSS and become a patron, you get access to our bonus news episode we do, and with our other podcasts, there's now going to be bonus content coming along for those as well. I think it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
Bye.
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 But if she stopped Boris Johnson, we'd all be okay with it. Sorry. Yes, carry on.